Hello, this is the Stories Beside channel. I release videos every day for you. Subscribe and click the bell.
So angry with her snide question that she said angrily, "There's no need to call anywhere. I'll look after Thomas." Helen smiled immediately, as if she had expected nothing else. "That's good. Here are your keys. I'm leaving early tomorrow morning. You can figure it out on your own." Wow! It just popped into Susan's head. She took the spare keys with her. She was sure that I would help her deceive her husband. As Susan saw her friend off, Susan almost regretted her sudden decision. Helen was gone as quickly as she had appeared. It was for her impetuosity and determination that Thomas had fallen in love with her 5 years ago, choosing one of her 2 girlfriends. Helen and Susan had always been close, but modest Susan had never been noisy, not particularly witty, and Helen's determination was far from her. The reason they were friends was probably because opposites attract. Helen, with her violent temperament, sometimes had to be restrained. Only Susan could do it. Even Helen's mom would ask her, "Susan, do your best to talk her out of that pimplay Ethan. He'll cheat and dump her, and we'll have to deal with her tantrums." And indeed, it turned out that Ethan, whom Helen was crazy about, had a family and 2 children. Susan was able to prove it to her friend, who was already dreaming of getting married to a handsome man who was having affairs with everyone. Helen, in turn, was also not a dependent Susan kindness. She helped her with housing. When she became friends with a foreign modest girl in her first year, invited her to her place. Susan lived in the dormitory during her sophomore year, but their friendship was so strong that now Helen could stay in her room overnight, especially on those evenings when there were dances nearby. The friends shared their joys and sorrows, but they were not lucky enough to fall in love. They fell in love with the same guy. Thomas studied at a prestigious specialty in their institute, 2 courses older. He was enthusiastic about his future profession, and he was prophesied a brilliant future. The slender, handsome man was a dream of any girl, but he was not attracted to them at all. He was always busy with business. It can be said that Helen herself took the initiative, and he first succumbed to the charm of blue-eyed, cheerful girl, and then fell in love with her. Helen and Thomas were married rather quickly. Helen's family organized a wedding fun, rich, for fellow students. It was a real holiday, including a feast of the belly, which is important for the poor, knowing the granite of science. The party was long and lavish, and who could escort the bride down the aisle? Susan, of course, was a witness at the wedding. The girl tried to smile and pretend that she was having fun, although the cats were scratching at her soul. She tried not to look in the direction of the groom all evening. As soon as she noticed that he was showing interest in Helen, Susan immediately stepped aside. How could anyone get in the way of the maid of honor? Susan, of course, continued to communicate with Helen all the following years. They are friends, but at their home tried not to be at their home. It must be said that she was lucky to have a place to live. In a small hut on the outskirts lived her distant relative, who was either a 3rd or 4th cousin of her grandmother. Susan, out of the kindness of her heart, began to visit the old woman at the request of her relatives. She had never seen Kathy before, but they became friends. Very soon the positive and hardworking girl became the right hand of the old woman, who had long been difficult to leave the house. Kathy was not very ill and died in her sleep. After burying her relative, Susan found out that she had become the owner of her house, and her friends, the newly married couple, had just bought a house nearby. However, it was almost an exchange, as Thomas had an apartment in another neighborhood from his parents. Susan visited them only when she knew for sure that her friend's husband was absent. It was very hard to see Thomas looking at Helen with loving eyes. In 5 years, Susan had never met someone who could displace Thomas from her heart, so she had lived close to the man who occupied her thoughts. But now it was as if he didn't exist for Susan. A stranger's husband, a friend's husband, and just under 3 years ago, a neighbor's family had had an accident. "Thomas, are you sure you're not going to Mary's birthday party?" "No, Helen," I explained. "We're delivering a program to a client. We're past the deadline, and the guys are having some problems, and they're asking for help." I promised. "How can I get a ride?" "You alone have fun without me, Mary. By the way, congratulate me, and also ask me to apologize on my behalf." With these words, Thomas kissed his wife and went out. The day was a weekday and work was not waiting. Helen sighed, stretched in her cozy bed, and fell asleep again. She woke up when the sun was already high. After eating breakfast, she quietly began to brush her feathers. She took a shower and spent a long time primping herself in the mirror. Then she carefully worked on her evening dress. She took one dress out of the closet and another out of the closet. To one of the shoes were uncomfortable. The second will look gloomy in an evening cafe. But this one, soft turquoise, very much suited her. And not too bright, will not overshadow the outfit of the birthday girl, and favorably emphasizes the eyes. "Good, so good," wrote Helen, throwing on a dress with a hanger and dancing in front of the mirror. Since celebrating the wedding with Thomas, Helen lived easily and carefree, having sold the apartment of Thomas's parents, quickly bought a new, bigger, cozier, and most of its cost was paid by themselves, but as themselves, Helen, of course, did not work. Why should she? If her husband earned so well. Helen told her friends and opened her blue eyes wide. "We didn't even notice how we paid off the mortgage. Everything, thank God, is enough. I chose the furniture for the new apartment myself, carefully according to my taste, so that everything fit together." Going to the store gave Helen incomparable pleasure, and she gradually became almost an expert in the world of shopping. Slowly the girl began to deal with herself, visited the pool, spa procedures, and the fact that she had a permanent makeup artist, hairdresser, and manicurist, and nothing to say. No, she did not become pampered and proud boorish, but modest service to her person began to afford. It pleased her. "Why did you study then?" Friends asked. 5 years at a prestigious faculty, and now the diploma is lying somewhere. Why did you have to work so hard? "Well, hello," Helen marveled. "First of all, the diploma does not interfere with me a bit. Higher education is a prestigious thing after all. You know, people have a different attitude when you tell them the name of your university. What to do all day long if you don't have to work? My friends didn't calm down. No children. Well, children are a living thing." Helen waved them away. "It will always be in time, while we with Thomas do not want to deprive themselves of freedom." "And what do you mean? What to do?" "And the apartment. You have to fix it up, take care of yourself. You know, I feel sorry for my husband. You come with him somewhere to a banquet, for example, or on the anniversary of his leadership, and he has a shaggy wife with rough heels and burrs on the nails. I'll embarrass him. And he's not a laborer. He's the head of the department, by the way. So it should be his look, not yours." Arguing interlocutors. "Yes, of course." Helen laughed. "The king makes the entourage. Have you heard such wisdom, girls? And the husband makes successful who?" "The wife. That's me. I'm the reason Thomas rose." However, soon Helen's friends became quite different. Just like herself, spa and shopping enthusiasts. Those former ones had to earn money. They had no time to listen to the petty troubles of a well-off lady. Helen didn't care about them at all. She spun in a whirlwind of previously unavailable pleasures. No, of course, her parents had provided her with the best of everything before. An only daughter, how could they spoil her? But there was no waiting around, no begging. Thomas entrusted her with all the family bookkeeping and did not interfere in economic affairs, and Helen, with her irrepressible energy, just what she needed. She didn't spend, didn't squander her husband's money, no. There were calculations, but for herself first and foremost. Today, on Mary's birthday, their common old acquaintances gathered, and subconsciously, Helen wanted to surprise everyone, to look the best, to have fun, to prove to who knows who that she lived a wonderful, full life. Preparing for this event took some creative effort on her part. Finally, she was ready, and that's when the phone rang. "Hello. Yes, I paged you. I'm on my way out." And Helen, humming a cheerful song under her nose, ran out of the apartment to the entrance where a cab was waiting for her. Thomas came home from work late at night. Helen was still out. The house seemed empty without her. He dialed his wife's cell phone number. "Honey, how are you? Did you have a good time?" "Oh, Thomas, I'm so glad you're free. It's been a long holiday. It's been a lot of fun, but I'm tired. If you come with me, it will be wonderful." Thomas laughed. There she was, his wife, having fun and tired. How he loved her childlike spontaneity and inconsistency. "All right, I'll be right there," he answered. "Then we'll have tea together." The restaurant was noisy, smoky, and somehow not festive. Entering the room, Thomas involuntarily wrinkled his nose. He had never liked eating establishments, and he considered restaurants, if not a breeding ground for vice, then certainly a haven for idlers. "Handsome, come to us." A well-drunk girl with smeared eyes clung to him. She grabbed him by the elbow and began to pull him towards her laughing friends of the same obscene appearance. Another time. Carefully but firmly withdrawing her arm, Thomas said. He found Helen at the bar, where most of Mary's guests, the staunchest ones, were already seated. The rest of them were too drunk to try to do anything on their own. Only a few more sober couples were stomping around in the middle of the room, dancing to the soft music of a small orchestra, and the orchestra, consisting of an accordionist, a trumpeter, a couple of guitarists, and a drummer, and the dancing couples, and even the bartender of the bar, though torn by customers, seemed to be tired and trying to portray life from the last effort. Helen decided to have a coffee, feeling that she needed to chase away the hops a little, but the decision was risky, and she had been fending off inebriated company for a long time. Her husband showed up just in time. It had to be said. "Thomas," Helen shouted excitedly when she saw him from afar. "There's my husband." This was meant for the drunken blonde, who tried to drag her to the dance, trying to combine clumsily drunken gallantry with brute physical force. "Husband full of peers," yelled one of the blonde's friends. "No, this is not our husband. We do not want such a husband. Come on, honey, I'll show you the sky and diamonds." Mumbled in the meantime, barely standing on his feet, the hapless suitor, and dragged Helen by the arm, not worrying about hurting her. "Come on, boss. Get her out." Cheered on by the jackals surrounding the blonde. "We're going out tonight. Take the girl." "Let her go." Softly, said Thomas, coming close to the blonde man. He looked at Thomas, unable to realize what they wanted from him, and stubbornly continued to pull the girl by the arm away from the bar. "What are you doing, kid?" A more sober-looking man, a forehead of absolutely criminal appearance, with tattoos on his fingers, moved at Thomas. "You got your paw on the boss." He made an imperceptible movement, and Thomas lost his balance. He struggled to stay on his feet and retaliated, but immediately the other cronies took the fight in a ring. Hands, heads, and bodies flashed in the smoke, and a woman's shrieks and screams were heard. A multi-armed, dense tangle of men's bodies appeared next to the bar. Helen couldn't see, but she knew that Thomas was somewhere down there, under that pile, and she called out to him. "Thomas, Thomas!" The guard blew his whistle, and in an instant the whole gang disappeared from the hall. Only Thomas was still lying on the floor, bleeding underneath. "Thomas! Open your eyes, Thomas!" shouted Helen, leaning over her husband. Her friends tried to calm her down. "I'll go with you, Helen," said Mary, who in a way considered herself guilty of what had happened. It was her party that had ended so unhappily. When the ambulance arrived, she helped Helen onto the stretcher on which Thomas had been placed. Helen had no idea what was happening, and when the bloodless Thomas was loaded onto the gurney and wheeled into the operating room, she sat almost unconsciously on a table in the white hallway and closed her eyes as if she wanted to hide from reality. The surgery went on for a long time. The surgeon came out to the exhausted Helen. As long as he sleeps, life is out of danger, but the drunken bully's knife had damaged her vertebrae. The doctor hid his eyes. "When can I pick him up?" Helen asked, not realizing the danger of the situation. "Not soon, I'm afraid." The doctor began to wipe the glasses unnecessarily. For a long time, he needs absolute peace. And what? Helen impatiently fixed her eyes on the doctor's frowning face. "Your husband won't be able to walk yet." "What do you mean he can't walk?" Helen smiled confusedly. "He won't be able to walk, but what about it? It's good that the blow didn't hit his vital organs, but then you should be thankful that he's alive. Get him on disability. He can probably work from home. He's an engineer, you said. How's the disability?" Helen was just heartbroken. "Maybe someday, but for now, your husband needs your help. Your care and kindness will help him recover, of course, but a full life is out of the question." Helen felt as if she had been replaced, and she went to doctors and institutes, but in vain. Susan, when she heard about the accident, came running to her old friend, and now she was always near her. She empathized with her so much, helped to prepare Helen's apartment, everything for Thomas's discharge, advised her how to arrange the house so that both of them would be more comfortable. She helped in word and deed. It made her heart bleed to think of Thomas. A beautiful and clever young man, now he would be trapped inside the walls of the apartment. And what kind of ordeal would he endure in the hospital room and the operating room? Susan could think of no one else. Her heart still belonged to him alone. She watched Helen's efforts to help her husband regain his health with envy, but also with joy. May he be happy at least in what Helen could do. Thought Susan, and one day said, "Helen, I didn't even realize you had such a heart. What a good girl you are. All that worry means you love Thomas very much. What are you talking about? What the hell kind of heart? Don't you realize I have to live with an invalid, a half-man? I don't want to. Well, I realize I can't leave him, everyone. You'll think I'm bad, and I'll have to waste my life on it." Helen burst into tears. Susan was shocked by her words, and especially her tone. "How can you say that? Thomas has suffered because of you. Who asked him to? If he's not a man and he can't fight, why the hell did he get involved? He's caused me the kind of trouble you wouldn't wish on anyone." Divided Helen was no longer crying, but frantically planning her next trip to the medical luminary who could help her get the invalid, as she called her husband, back on his feet. Susan was simply amazed at how bluntly and cynically her friend explained her troubles. "You are only selfish." She was indignant as she watched her friend blowing the curls that had fallen from her forehead away from her face with an angry expression, and Helen looked particularly pretty. I'd look at you if you had such a thing. How selfish would you be?" In Helen's beautiful eyes, there were angry tears. She wailed for a long time about her plight, but Susan tried not to listen to her. There were many things about her friend that had often caused Susan rejection and even dislike, but now she couldn't accept what Helen was saying. Full of sympathy for Thomas, who was not even aware of the treacherous soul of his wife, Susan even dared to visit him in the hospital a few times, but Thomas was embarrassed. Susan herself did not know how to behave. Knowing Helen's attitude towards her husband, she could not pretend that all was well. It would look silly to cheer her up. Thomas is a sober-minded man, a strong man. He doesn't need these appealing slogans. The embarrassed Susan sat there for 5 minutes, and then she hurried out of the room. And then her friend struck her in the heart. It seemed impossible to betray someone once betrayed, but Helen managed. Helen had dropped by Susan's room a couple of times, cheerful, smelling of perfume, her eyes shining as they had in her early youth. Oh, how Susan remembered that look on her friend's face. Excitement, incredible energy and activity. All these were signs that the girl had fallen in love. And as Susan realized, her old friend was not crazy about her own husband. "Spit it out, Helen," she said sternly when her friend dropped by the other day to borrow a flat iron. "Mine's burnt out, and I'm walking around like an ugly woman." She explained to Susan, "I'm going to keep it until I buy a new one." "You don't care. You don't curl." Well, Helen was the one who cared about her appearance. She pretended not to take Susan's hint. "What do you mean, like get a curl? What are you talking about, girlfriend?" But she was stretching her mouth from the scarlet lipstick in a wide smile. "You're not messing with my head." Susan wouldn't give up. "I can see you at 100 meters. Who you got yourself, you hussy?" "What do you mean, a slut?" Helen also resented me. "You know I would never." "Never her." Susan laughed in her face. "And you cheated just once?" "Yes, I'm in love, Susan." And Helen cried. Susan had to listen to a story that Helen thought would exonerate her. The poor girl, alone, forgotten, neglected by everyone, and only her invalid husband with her, day and night, demanding troubles and cares, incredible efforts on the part of the faithful wife. And here he is, loving, tender, affectionate, intelligent, understanding everything, in short, the epithets that a true man should have. He's like that, you know, Susan. And Helen was silent, covering her eyes, unable to describe adequately all the wonderful qualities of Matthew's character. That was the name of her lover. "I remember you said the same thing about Thomas." Susan didn't soften at all. I had quickly forgotten what he was like, and he still is, so how could he be worse? "He's the same Thomas, aren't you?" "Yeah, of course he is. He's the same, but not the same. I lived behind him like a stone wall. He did everything for me, and now, how can you understand?" And Helen gave her friend an almost contemptuous look. "You've been alone all your life. At least have a lover or something? Otherwise you're sitting there all infallible." Susan looked at her friend in silence, and she couldn't stand her gaze. "What are you looking at? What did I say wrong? Only the plain truth, right?" "Well, Helen, I'll tell you the plain truth too, you bastard. Not only are you selfish, but you're a traitor." Friends quarreled for a long time. Yesterday, after a chance meeting, they seemed to make up, had coffee, but still unexpected was the morning Helen came to Susan. Helen acted as if nothing had happened, but Susan? She was used to all the twists and turns of life, and she was always ready to open the door to anyone who called at it. Susan had not slept much during the night. Her friend's request had stirred her soul. She tossed and turned in her comfortable bed, opened the windows, and drank water. When it became clear that she couldn't doze off that easily, she threw a blanket over her shoulders and stepped out onto the balcony into the coolness. The town was sleeping peacefully, only somewhere far away, in the neighborhood of detached small houses, where the new building had not reached, barked something alarmed dogs. "Why are you barking?" Susan asked them. "People are asleep, and you're barking, and you're asleep." She was always talking to something when no one could hear her, to a teacup that slipped out of her hands, to a tree that caught a branch in her hair, to a stray cat that came into her path and looked with a green gaze straight into her eyes, demanding food. Helen's knowledge of this habit of hers would have twisted a finger at her temple. Blessed are you, Susan. But Susan, some of her thoughts and feelings were hidden deep inside. It was enough that the people around her knew that she was not a stupid girl, though she did not have enough stars from the sky. She is not grasping in life, but she knows how to climb all the way and tear off a piece of herself, that she is strict, if not to say harsh. She doesn't tolerate men around her. Maybe she's been through enough. No one knew. Since childhood, only Helen knew her, but that one did not bother to think about the character of her friend and could not tell anyone anything special about her. Even if it was necessary that she was blessed, she would confirm it. Such a modest woman that it's sickening of, but Helen was always scolding her for it. If only her friend knew what it was like for Susan not to show her feelings for Thomas. How she could use that proverbial modesty to cover her love, her refusal to communicate with him. She even stopped going to discos with Helen, realizing that she would be with Thomas. And how can you take away the excitement when you see his fluffy, like a girl's eyelashes over his brown eyes? How do you hold back the disappointed exhale when he's hugging someone else in front of you? So what if it's your best friend? The more it hurts. It must be said that at first Susan, with all her body and soul, rushed towards the young man. She flew to wherever he was. She talked about him. She was burning with love. It seemed that he was also drawn to Susan, but one evening, sitting with Helen on a bench near the entrance, Susan suddenly heard, "Susan, I'm in love." Her friend even seemed a little embarrassed. "That's not like Helen." "Again?" Susan laughed. "This is the 5th time this year." "You're laughing, and I haven't slept for 2 nights." Helen roared. "I've never had anything like this in my life, you know that." She continued to sob. She wondered who is this scoundrel who tortures her favorite girl. "Don't cry, silly." She stroked Helen's back. "You should be happy. It's great to fall in love for real, and even in spring." "You think so?" Helen exhaled into her friend's chest and looked at her with blue eyes full of tears. She was just like the doll from the picture, but her feelings were really strong. "Do you think Thomas will love me too?" "He doesn't pay any attention to me. He's dancing with you or whispering with Clara from the 5th group, and I'm suffering." Helen continued to describe her suffering, but Susan could no longer hear her. After Thomas's name was called, it was as if she had been hit on the head with something terribly heavy and dull. And from that moment, she sank into utter despair, and that was it. She stopped flying. Her heart was smoldering in her breast, burning slowly from a great feeling that was carefully concealed, and it was impossible to let this fire burn, lest it should burn the 3 of them at once. Toward morning, Susan fell into a heavy sleep and awoke unaccustomedly late, at 11:30. The sun was beating through the bedroom window and had already warmed the linoleum on the floor beside the bed. My head ached, and with a heavy heart I began to pack, and everything was going wrong. She lost her hairbrush, the hair dryer wouldn't turn on, the coffee came out of the turbo and flooded the stove. She wondered how she would explain Helen's departure to Thomas. Would they be able to tell a decent lie? The whole story disgusted her, and Susan felt like she was about to jump into the unknown. The cliff did not seem quiet and peaceful. Finally, the shower was over. Her head was in order. The rest of the spilled coffee was drunk. There was nowhere to go. It was time to go, no matter how much she procrastinated. Susan grabbed her purse and left the apartment. The morning had not yet fully turned into day. The weather was fine. While she got to the house of her friends, where she decided to walk, the girl calmed down a little and tuned it to the right wave. Be that as it may. After all, there was no fault of hers, and to decide for others their fate, it is not given to her. By the time she got there, it was about 12. She found the keys in her purse quickly, opened the door, hesitantly entered. Still, even though she'd been setting herself up all night and all morning, Susan was having a hard time. Now she would see Thomas. It had been many months since her unfortunate visit to the hospital, and the woman was worried. With a pounding heart, she walked to the deserted kitchen, took a carton of milk out of her bag, and put it in the refrigerator. Only after washing her hands, running a damp hand across her forehead, did she finally decide to walk to the room where Thomas was supposed to be. She was also helping Helen get her ready. Knocking lightly, she opened the door ajar. "May I?" Thomas, dressed in a white t-shirt and sports pants, was sitting in a chair by the computer desk. The man didn't immediately realize that it wasn't his wife walking around the apartment and was very surprised when he heard a knock on the door and then saw Susan enter. "Susan? What are you doing here? How did you get in?" Susan silently showed his keys. "I don't understand. Where's Helen? Did something happen? She had to leave on business." Thomas's face twisted, and he gritted his teeth. She'd gone to the sea with Matthew, after all. Susan saw Thomas's hand on the table, clenched into a fist, and the jowls on his face flared. She could see that he was sharply upset and trying to contain his anger. But what struck her most was that he wasn't surprised that he'd known before. "Where did you?" The question froze on her lips. "How do I know?" Thomas grinned unkindly. "Well, lately, Helen hasn't been very shy with me. She treated me like a piece of furniture. Could talk quietly on the phone at 2 o'clock as if I were handicapped and on my ears." Susan didn't know how to soothe or comfort him, said the first thing that came to mind. "Thomas, Helen is just tired." And then she realized how stupid that sounded, and Thomas grinned evilly. "Tired? Tired of what? I do the cooking. I do the laundry too. I even learned how to use the vacuum cleaner. But I can't go to the store, and I can't take out the garbage, and you've come to cover for your girlfriend? Well, I can tell you that you shouldn't. I'm doing just fine on my own." He turned his baby carriage around and headed for the other room, and Susan was struck by his every word. She had thought she would find an invalid lying there, a helpless sick man who needed care every minute of the day. Yes, of course, Thomas, the Thomas she knew and loved, was going to be like that, independent and strong and angry. The astonished Susan fully accepted his anger and resentment toward his wife. She probably should have left, but for some reason she was angry too and followed him. Thomas was looking out the large window facing the street. You could see by the look on his face that he was a little overcome with emotion. "I understand you, Thomas," Susan said softly, "but I had nothing to do with it. I didn't know, I promise you." Thomas did not look her in the face. He felt ashamed that he had attacked Susan. She had never given any reason to suspect her of the slightest deceit or intrigue. She was, in Thomas's mind, one of the finest girls he'd ever met. "I'm sorry." Muffled, he said, "I must have misspoken. I didn't mean to offend you, did I? Well then, Why don't we at least have some tea? I've been walking so long, it's already hot outside. Come on." The man changed his tone abruptly. "You do the kitchen, and I'll finish my work quickly. I've got a little bit to do, and then I'm free." While Susan made tea and sliced a cake, for which she had specially visited her favorite pastry shop, Thomas was able to finish the work scheduled for today. Rubbing his hands together in anticipation of the tea party, he rolled into the kitchen and washed his hands under the faucet for a long time. "I'm a sick man. I can wash here too. I just need to write places for children and the handicapped." His black humor did not seem so black because surprisingly the man's mood rose, and at the table he was having fun, as if he had forgotten about his wife and her treacherous departure. "So you work from home?" Susan asked, though she had heard about it from her conversations with Helen. "Susan, you know that work is more important to me than anything else." Thomas answered and looked her in the eyes for the first time. Susan knew. She saw that familiar look and remembered how from their first meeting she had remembered those brown eyes, the deep, penetrating gaze of Thomas, with which he seemed to encompass not the outer, but the inner essence of a person. How then did it happen that their life together with Helen turned out so unsuccessfully? Or was it all to blame, the fateful incident in that very restaurant be damned? She involuntarily averted her eyes so as not to betray her feelings and asked, "And how do you get the assignment, and how do you manage to work with the group? After all, your guys probably continue to work as before. There are no problems." Thomas answered with a noticeably more cheerful tone. "We used to talk on the internet a lot if we had to make a decision. The machine, as he called the computer, stayed on 24 o'clock. That's what you do. I remember one night I dreamed of an important move, jumped up to the computer, and even Skype had to be used to wake Jack up. The two of us were working it out, his wife yelling at me for not letting us sleep, Helen yelling at me. Then Thomas goes quiet, and Helen comes to mind. Susan had to invent a simpler topic to distract him from his sad thoughts. Do you ever go outside? You're like Schumacher in your wheelchair, aren't you? No, I'm mostly on the balcony. Thomas shrugged it off. Why not? The weather's so nice out. A street is a street, and there are neighbors and all sorts of animals and birds. Susan was puzzled. There's a staircase on the first floor that I can't climb by myself. I don't want to ask anyone. What about Helen? She's at home. Well, Helen, she's always busy. She says you can get some air on the balcony. It's nothing. I'm often on the balcony, especially in the evening. Susan, to be honest, didn't understand. Helen had always told her that she was almost carrying pots for her husband, but it turned out to be the other way around. She knew her friend's habit of justifying herself, no matter what the circumstances, but to make up such a brazen composition, to elevate herself to the rank of Sister of Mercy, it's too much. While Susan was digesting the information she had received, Thomas had quite deftly dragged the dishes to the sink and had already begun to name them. Susan took a dish towel and began to wipe the cups, standing next to him. How about after tea we go for some air? A walk in the park? He looked at her in surprise and happily agreed. They were having fun. Thomas was joking with himself. I'm the beneficiary today. I have to look good. He pulled one t-shirt after another out of the closet, then looked at Susan and discarded it. No, that won't do. We have to have the same color scheme. Why is that? Susan wondered, amused by the man's grip on the pile of clothes. Why not? Let everyone see that we are together. There must be an ensemble in everything, even in clothes. The blood rushed to Susan's cheeks. Silly, innocent jokes, but she was still relieved and pleased that he had at least united in this way. Opening all the windows wide open to air out the apartment in their absence, they moved into the hallway. The elevator, then the proverbial stairs, which, with Susan's help, they overcame almost imperceptibly. And now they were in the park. Fresh wind, bright greenery, birds chirping. Thomas had a look of bliss on his face. He easily rolled his stroller along the sidewalk, and Susan walked beside him and did not even notice that he was not walking beside her, but sitting. She had no thoughts that he was an inferior, defective man. What kind of a handicapped man is he? He is the smartest, the most beautiful, and the best. Susan settles down on the bench. Thomas stops his stroller across the street so he can see her face. "Oh my God, Susan," he said, covering his eyes. "You just made me so happy. Do you realize that?" He looked at her again with that penetrating gaze of his. "It's the first time I've been this happy in years. Do you know what it's like to walk outside? I don't care if it's in a stroller. It's happiness to sit in the sun, and if it was raining, I'd be happy in the rain, and if it was windy, you'd be wet in the rain and cold in the wind." Susan laughed, not letting him finish. Now she didn't remember how worried she had been before she came. All thoughts of what and how she would explain it had crashed into Thomas's simplicity. She was at ease with him, as if there were no years that had passed, her anguish about him being someone else's husband, and she had finally made up her mind. "Thomas, I probably shouldn't ask that question. Helen is my friend, but I don't understand what's holding you back. You're so independent, aren't you?" "Yeah, I feel sorry for her. She's not used to work. She's not used to life. But she's adapted." He grinned again, bitterness showing through his smile. "Now I don't even know what to do." "But you love her, don't you?" I used to." Thomas grunted, embarrassed, and turned the conversation to something else. There was an inner tact that her friend Helen lacked, thought Susan, looking at Thomas's smiling lips and changing face. She laughed at his jokes, said something to him, while she herself didn't quite understand even the topic of the conversation. She was simply enjoying these precious hours of conversation with the one who from the first day of their acquaintance had been the only one to occupy her thoughts and feelings, but the evening chill was beginning to be felt. "What's up, Goose?" Susan addressed Thomas affectionately. "For a first walk, I think that's quite enough, don't you?" "I would have stayed here, Susan," he confessed. "But I'm afraid you're too strict. You'll punish me for breaking the regime." "How would I punish you?" Susan laughed. "Not serving dinner? So you're the one with the mustache." Again, with jokes and laughter, we started on the way back. A light dinner seemed enough for both of them. Thomas was tired from the fresh air. Susan, who had been sleep-deprived and worried all this time, had not taken care of anything substantial. Helen had eggs and butter in the refrigerator, thank God, so we ate what normal people usually eat for breakfast, omelettes. Now that we've eaten, we can go to sleep. Susan laughed, mimicking Mama Toad from the cartoon. The dishes were put away again, and then Susan, despite Thomas's objections, quickly hung up his scattered clothes in the closet and said goodbye. "Well, I'm off. What can I buy for tomorrow?" "Yes, I'm not fussy. One potato or pasta is enough for me," answered the embarrassed Thomas. He was uncomfortable, a grown man, but he was sitting and waiting for a stranger, a beautiful woman even more so, to bring him groceries. "All right, then it's up to me, okay?" Susan smiled. "I'll come over right after work. Okay, good night." "Good night, Susan," Thomas replied affectionately. "Thank you, you know." He looked away embarrassed. As Susan walked home, she had so many thoughts on her mind. Why hadn't Helen left at least the basic necessities? Why hadn't she even thought to give money or warn her that there was nothing in the house to cook with? Why? But she shoved all these economic endeavors away from her and began to sing quietly to herself a long-standing song. Couldn't she just be happy that she was alive and well? That she spent almost the whole day with the man she loved? Even if he was a stranger's husband, Susan had not trespassed on him in any way, but they had had that day, well, even if it was only half a day, but what joyful hours it had been. She looked at Thomas, admired him, listened to his voice. Susan walked on and could not feel her feet, immersed in the depths of her own happiness. She was sure she would not sleep again for a long time tonight. But as soon as she was in her bed, she fell into a happy, serene sleep. It was not surprising that Thomas had not slept that night. He had a lot to think about. Why did his and Helen's life have to be like this? After a day spent outdoors with Susan, the man felt like the past was just a dream. He seemed to have a second wind today. Everything was refracted now through these half-days. Peaceful, full sun and sky, hours, time that was adorned with good, not burdensome conversation, bird chirping. In fact, today he was finally breathing fully for the first time since that fight in the restaurant. For the first time, he was truly enjoying life. Why aren't you happy? Helen used to pick on him. But why? Why aren't you rejoicing loudly? I am rejoicing loudly. It's just you listening quietly. Thomas laughed and admired his beloved, beautiful wife. She opened her blue eyes wide and began to tease him again. You, Thomas, are just a babaca. And she would laugh. Everything seemed funny to her then. Jokes, fun, the constant companions of youth, and they both had the same habits. They liked the same songs, movies, were friends with classmates. Common friends, just as noisy and mischievous, often gathered at their homes, singing songs to the guitar, dancing. There were times when one of the guys, Thomas's associates, in the midst of the fun took out a pen and a notebook from his pocket and sketched some entertaining scheme. He would show one, and the others would immediately follow. Often the evening continued in the hall, where under the screaming record, shouting the singer, the guys furiously discussed the details of the drawing. And the girls, later brides and wives, with an understanding look at their cavaliers, sighed and went to the kitchen and continued their hen party there. For Thomas and his friends, work was the meaning of life, a hobby, a mission. Helen got used to this character of her husband, especially since this work brought excellent material results. The young engineers had time to work and have fun. Helen did not feel neglected by her husband's attention. On the contrary, when the guests left, the young couple threw themselves into each other's arms as if they had just met after a long separation. Thomas, are you really happy with me? Naively asked Helen, who could not be fed with anything but a verbal declaration of love. Don't you know? Thomas teased her, who, of course, did not believe the cunning wife, who pretended to be a girl and flapped her eyelashes. Oh, the husband is here, marveled Helen in the evening. And I did not look at the time, and dinner is not yet. Well, nothing. Now we'll think of something. The husband rubbed his palms and started cooking. Helen did her best to pretend that she was ready to help him, but most of the time she ended up sitting across from him and began to act out a funny scene in the store or at the bus stop. Thomas laughed, and meanwhile from under his hands came out another miracle of culinary art. Everyone knows that men are the best cooks. Condescension and forgiveness. Now Thomas saw himself from the outside. He forgave his wife not only cute flaws, over time he learned to condescend to her small, if not to say petty concerns about the cozy nest. Helen, don't you care what I sleep on, what I eat on, and what I cover myself with? He was puzzled when his wife dragged him to the store for new bedding. Yes, of course not. Again, Helen's eyes widened in horror. Let it be beautiful, Thomas. We've got money, so why not buy nice things? The hostess, who could hardly cook and had no intention of learning, knew what glasses were needed, for what drinks, how to arrange the forks in the order of serving. What dishes, what order? Thomas marveled. What are you talking about, wife? He didn't care much about such trifles, although after work he wanted to eat sometimes terribly. The cookery shop on the first floor of their house was a great help. And then the trouble happened. Thomas knew right away that Helen couldn't take it. Yes, she showed miracles of heroism, recognized, worried, searched for doctors, but Thomas knew everything. Helen wasn't his. It was the elusive movement of her lips, the glance cast at him, the tone she used to speak to him. Not a single person would have suspected Helen of a change in her attitude toward her husband. On the contrary, everyone around admired his wife. His attending doctor used to say, "Well, your wife would bring a dead man back to his feet. I envy you." Thomas, who by Helen's breathing could judge her mood, closed himself up too. Suddenly, the warm ray that connected the couple and made his wife his own and the only one. The husband felt in an instant that Helen had already cut him out of her life, and so it turned out. With the move home from the hospital, Thomas became convinced that he had been right. Apparently, it is true that when a sick person is not under a lot of care, he tries to get back on his feet on his own. At home, Helen relaxed, no longer preoccupied with her husband's health. She no longer believed that he could be helped. She tried to use all the resources of free medicine. While her husband was in the hospital, nannies helped him, washed him, served him, moved him on a gurney, rolled him to the right building for examination. Helen only organized and managed the process, and the rest of the deadlines set by the doctors were in an indefinite distance. Maybe later? These words of doctors were supposed to inspire faith in the future, but in fact served only as a consolation to the patient and his relatives. To take him out for paid procedures, to take him somewhere in a wheelchair? No. Helen's not ready for that. How could she cope with such a load? And financially, it was not very good. The supplies they did have, thanks to Thomas's occasional foresight, were quickly melting away. Helen's parents had long since retired, and it was impossible to turn to them for help. Some money was raised by the guys at Thomas's office. What next? Thomas realized that something had to be done urgently. He saw the longing in his wife's eyes, watched how she looked in the mirror, and looked at her wrinkles. Once he waited for her to leave for the store, he called a friend. "Hey, Jack, listen, why don't you give me a job? I'll do what I can for now, and then we'll see. You can't just lie there. Your head'll go flat." "Oh, glad to see you, old man. You're just in time. We need some help around here." Maybe they don't need any help, Thomas reasoned, but if one of his friends approached him, would he refuse? They would decide how to pay him, but he couldn't do without work. There is already on the table is not particularly substantial food lately. When he was engrossed in his work, he immediately forgot about his health problems. Even a couple of times he involuntarily wanted to get up and walk, but immediately remembered his immobility and got angry at the whole world. But unlike Helen, he couldn't show it to anyone. Helen was pitied by everyone. How she takes care of a sick husband, puts her life on the altar of his health. Helen supported this legend in every possible way, giving in and discussing with them diagnoses and treatments. In short, the entire recovery of her spouse, a loyal and strong fighting friend of Thomas. She was able to present herself in such a way that she did not whine, did not complain, However, everyone understood Helen is a heroine and sympathy is absolutely necessary for her. She needed a vacation. Is that conceivable? A young beauty, and she sits alone all day. The mother of one of Helen's friends lamented, "No sleep, no rest, poor girl." "It is necessary to rest, my dear." For some reason, no one considered Thomas a society, an invalid, what to talk to him about, and anyway, how to live with only one person for months without going out into the world. Helen, they were beckoning her to visit, inviting her to dinner parties as well. She observed decorum, arriving late and leaving early to court her husband. At one of these evenings she was seated with a tall, gray-eyed, handsome man who kindly courted her, poured wine. He did not dare to ask her to dance, but when he noticed that she was going to leave the society, he asked her to dance. "Would you allow me to escort you?" "Well, if you want, for God's sake," agreed Helen, evaluating, looking at his suit, obviously tailored to order. Broad shoulders. Handing the cape to the closet, the man introduced himself. "I'm Matthew." It was awkward. The table was so noisy. "I have a little business in." He named a town not far away. "I'm here a lot on business with friends. My name is Helen." The girl held out her hand and looked Matthew straight in the eye. I know quite a lot about you," Matthew said, bringing Helen's hand to his lips, and remembering all these events, the man sighed and turned from side to side. The morning is wiser in the evening. He finally decided and allowed himself to remember today. A park, flower beds with flowers, and on a bench under an acacia tree, sitting a beautiful girl. "Susan," Thomas said and smiled. The next day, Susan arrived at exactly 6:00 in the evening. How she managed to get home from work so quickly and to go to the store and cook delicious cutlets at home, Thomas could not understand. Apparently, she was fast and skillful. Having filled the bathtub, without a word, Thomas rolled the chair to her. "Don't argue, please. I helped you yesterday, too. You didn't even wash your feet after the walk, for sure. No excuses today." Susan's stern voice sounded more to herself than to Thomas. It was true, they hadn't had time to do that yesterday, and both of them were embarrassed. So today, the girl had to act like Frickin' Bok from the cartoon. She helped Thomas to undress down to his underwear and get into the bathtub. Thomas, strangely enough, wasn't too shy. What could he do if he was in such trouble? He would have helped his friend just as much. Susan rubbed his back, her trembling hands occasionally touching the smooth skin, checked again that everything was all right, and walked away hiding an embarrassed look. While Thomas washed, she boiled potatoes, mashed them with butter, milk, and garlic cloves, according to her grandmother's recipe. When the steamed and satisfied Thomas was put in the stroller and brought to the kitchen, everything on the table was sparkling. "Am I in heaven?" Thomas exclaimed and began to eat with pleasure. The evening had brought them closer together. Susan lightly ran her hand over Thomas' head as she said goodbye. "Well, see you tomorrow." He caught her hand, shook it, and said, "Susan, you are certainly a bright hope. You know that, don't you?" "What would I do without you?" 2 weeks passed like a day. Susan realized that in 2 days Helen would be back, and then that would be it. When she arrived at Thomas's house in the evening and opened the door, she was pleasantly surprised. The man was cooking something in the kitchen, and the smell was amazing. Susan entered the kitchen with a smile, looked surprised at the table set, wine, candles. Here, decided to say goodbye. "Wow," said the touched Susan quietly. "Let's have dinner. You must try my baked chicken." They both tried to put everything they were thinking about aside and just enjoyed the evening. Thomas was telling some funny stories and Susan was laughing. At one point, she saw Thomas freeze and look at her. Both of them fell silent. That long look revealed to each everything the other was thinking. Susan was looking at him, and Thomas was looking at her. "Susan, don't look at me like that. You're tearing my heart out. We just can't have anything because I'm an invalid. I would never put that kind of burden on you. You're not a burden." Susan quietly knelt down beside him and kissed him. In the morning, Susan woke up to someone looking at her, opened her eyes, and smiled. Thomas. He buried his face in her hair. "Jesus, Susan, what are you doing to me?" They made breakfast together, and then Thomas walked her to the door. "Susan, leave the keys." The girl nodded, put the keys on the nightstand, and said goodbye. "Thomas, I just want you to know. I've loved you always. I love you now." He covered his ears with his hands. "Don't say anything else. I realized a lot last night. Susan, I'm an invalid. We're not going to change anything. Understand, sooner or later, it will be the same as with Helen. You'll get tired and I won't survive it." "Thomas, no. You're wrong. You're wrong, that's all. When you love someone, you can't get tired of them. I don't want you to live with an invalid. I want you to be fine." "Thomas." He closed the door. Susan stood for a minute and rushed down the stairs, and Helen was going to enjoy the magnificent beaches of Thailand for the next 2 weeks. The clearest water, the almost deserted beach, the magnificent views. They were lucky enough to be in a place that had yet to be developed by tourists. It was great. No men with drunken shouting, no fat women with powerful torsos coming out of their swimsuits, and no one drags food in plastic bags and sacks from the table to their room. Everyone eats right here in the hotel restaurant. Is it any wonder? Such beautiful nothing to do. How long had she dreamed of it? And how long had it taken her to get to this point? But that wasn't even the point. And the sea and the beaches and the delicious food were only so good because Helen was here with her friend Matthew. "Matthew, isn't it great?" For the 100th time she asked Matthew, stroking his powerful arms stretched out on the sand. He lazily lifted himself up, hugged Helen, and hummed contentedly, "I feel good with you everywhere, my bunny," and reached for her neck with his lips, despite the fact that it was terribly hot, and any touch on another's heated body was close to death by number. Helen would laughingly move away. Matthew would pretend to reach for her even more, and this game would keep them occupied for quite some time. Then they'd run for a swim, and when the sun was already high, they'd go to the hotel. "What are we going to do today?" Helen asked a riddle and answered it herself. "We are going to lie down like seals and watch some stupid movie under the air conditioner." For some reason on vacation, it's always the stupid movies you want to watch. Matthew laughed. For Helen, vacation was a stretch, of course, but she didn't realize it. It seemed to her that until now she had been in a terrible captivity, for a long time the slave of some villain who had subjugated her to his cruel will. She had told Matthew so of her existence before their acquaintance. And then, at last, my knight on a white horse appeared and broke the fetters by which I was bound. Such pathos and childish thoughts flashed somewhere in the back of her mind, again bringing the girl back to the distant times of childhood and early romantic youth. "Well, yes, my car is exactly white in color," picked up her chattering lover. "What to do? I like light colors. You know, white is the embodiment of purity and freshness. It's a combination of all the colors of the spectrum." Showing her knowledge of physics, Helen continued, "I studied once, so I still have at least such scattered information in my head." "Oh, you're so smart." Matthew threw himself at her and the movie was completely forgotten. The young people enjoyed each other, and they did not get bored with this activity neither day nor night. Tired from such a stormy vacation, they fell asleep. Then Helen, who had come to her senses, pushed Matthew out of bed. "Matthew, get up quickly. We're going to be late for dinner." Their young bodies demanded support and food to restore their strength, and the lovers rushed downstairs to the restaurant, barely having time to put themselves in some sort of order. However, Moors in the hotel were the most free, and it was not customary among rich people to pay attention to who was dressed how. So it was all the same. Even in a loincloth, you could have dinner. A week later, there was a lot more people on the beach. "Oh my God, Matthew, our piece is over." Helen stretched her lips unhappily. Moreover, the female children's voices made it clear that they were from about the same place Helen and Matthew had come from. "Oh, come on," Matthew said indifferently. "Don't you have enough room? Isn't it cramped? Let them rest. We're not the only ones." He should have listened to Helen's words. He would have done even better if he had taken a closer look at the newly arrived compatriots, but the proverb says that if you knew where to fall, you would have made a bed. Nothing foreshadowed trouble on that usual sunny day vacationers. Having risen early, they tried to have time to sunbathe and swim in the sea. Then swimming was possible only in the pool. The sun was too hot. Helen and Matthew had time to ride a bike and go to a remote area where there was a special temple. Tired from the trip, they slept in the room for a while and in anticipation of dinner, went down to the restaurant. They had their favorite seat and a view from the large window of the sea with their backs to the door. Taking their usual seat, the couple waited for the waiter to bring their order. One of the best evenings of the lovers' lives was passing serenely. Matthew was about to start his coffee when suddenly someone clapped him on the shoulder. Irritation appeared on the man's face instantly, and he turned around to face the impolite passerby. But he had to hold back the scream that was about to burst from his lips. Standing beside him was his business partner, Parker, and this man in the business world occupied a position quite high behind Matthew himself. "Charles?" Matthew opened his arms cordially. "What brings you here?" "The birthday of the heart, as they say." "Hello, Matthew." Charles' voice was rough, as a master of life should be. "Is this where you've been hiding from us?" "I'm calling him. I'm going to offer him a deal, and he's hiding here with his beauty." "This is, as I understand, your Melissa, isn't it?" And he reached out to Helen with a smile, preparing to shake her hand. "Helen." Matthew spoke quickly, and Helen held out her hand to Charles, putting the sweetest smile on her face. "I thought you told me you were married to Melissa, didn't you? And you joked that Melissa was the only one who could save me." Charles was surprised and didn't say anything. "So what's the deal, Charles?" Taking him under his elbow, Matthew tried to steer the conversation away from him. But the moment was lost, and the place for a business conversation looked completely inappropriate. The men stood in the aisle, obstructing the movement of waiters in white uniform tunics, in full view of the entire room. Helen stood completely dumbfounded. The men, of course, could neither move away nor sit down at the table until the situation was clarified, and she decided to be the first to clarify it. Quickly crashing between the interlocutors, she addressed Charles first. "Did you say married to Melissa?" Her eyes bore into the man's. He was confused. "Well, yes, at Christmas. Didn't everyone say hello at the banquet?" Turning sharply to Matthew, Helen almost knocked his head on his chin. "Are you married?" Matthew remained stupidly silent. Charles, too, moved slightly aside in confusion, not knowing how to get out of the unpleasant situation, while Helen's shrieking could be heard throughout the restaurant. You tricked me." You said you were going to go to the mountains at Christmas, and you were organizing a wedding at the same time. Shut up, quiet. But menacingly Matthew told her, with anger looking into her blue eyes. There are people here. The girl was out of breath. Oh, there are people here, she shouted hysterically, and I'm not a human being. You're a scoundrel. You're a cheat. She slapped the man on the cheek. The restaurant patrons watched them in amazement. Matthew grabbed Helen by the arms and tried to stop her, but she stubbornly pulled out of his arms, trying to scratch his face, pull out his hair, or injure him in any way. A maitre in a black tuxedo was already approaching them, summoned by a waiter. Matthew let go of Helen, turned abruptly, and left without paying for dinner. Helen was led out under the arms from behind her and taken to an office where they gave her water and tried to calm her down. Madam, the maitre said to her politely, I sympathize with your troubles, but your companion has not paid for the dinner, and this is too much money for us to let you go without payment. Would you be so kind as to make a settlement? He bowed respectfully to Helen. Fortunately, she still had enough money on her card to pay the restaurant bill, and she managed to avoid an embarrassing eviction from the hotel and a scandal. When she finally returned to her room, she saw that Matthew's things were gone, and the corridor clerk informed her that the gentleman in the room had left the hotel with his luggage. It turned out that Matthew had gone home to his family that evening. Helen, who had spent all her savings on her card at the restaurant, was still lucky that the hotel room had been paid for in advance when Matthew had booked it, and the return ticket in electronic form was already in her phone. Helen was both anguished and excited at the same time to be able to go home. But stronger than all the mixed feelings, rage and hatred for her lover raged in her. After thinking for a while, she decided to live out the paid term in the hotel. She did not want to change her ticket without knowing the language. But more than this difficulty, she was frightened by the thought that the exchange would require additional expenses. There was only a little money left. She pondered. The breakfasts at the hotel were paid for. She could use her pennies to buy the cheapest food during the day. How much did she really need? Eat better in the morning, go to breakfast later. There's no way she'll be traveling to resorts and beaches anytime soon. At least she could have some fun at the expense of that asshole Matthew. Helen didn't care about the moral side of her affair. The scandal at the restaurant didn't stop her from enjoying a full breakfast alone either. Men, regulars of the restaurant, could not but remember the bright lady who slapped her companion in public, and there were no men willing to approach Helen. And what kind of acquaintance is there in the morning, whether sober or hungover? Of course, all this did not add to Helen's mood. She spent the rest of the time alone, driving away from herself the thoughts of returning home soon. But subconsciously, she tuned herself to her old life to meet her husband. She hadn't called him once while she'd been with Matthew, and now calls had become an expense. Nothing. The young woman consoled herself. Thomas hadn't gone anywhere. He hadn't started walking without me. I'll live peacefully and quietly, and I don't care about people like Matthew, the bastard. And the indignation, so diligently suppressed by her, flared up again inside. The image of the lover she now hated came back to her in a completely different form. She remembered his manner of deafening laughter, his grimaces when he tried to be nice to her. Greedy bastard, Helen sputtered to herself. Could not take a 5-star hotel, then I could at least to the end of the human rest. Of course, after a couple of days, the anger dulled in Helen, lying under an umbrella on the beach, already lazily, only by inertia, went over in her head the options for revenge against the traitor Matthew. Why is he a traitor? Helen could not explain, as she saw the situation only from her side. When her stay at the hotel had ended, she had thoughtlessly packed her suitcases, which now had to be carried by herself. She didn't want to pay anyone for fear of unforeseen expenses. Automatically packing, she indifferently looked around the room, the bed on which she had spent the first week so happily and the last few days so longingly. She had relaxed a little on the plane. The journey was already tiring, and coupled with the sad thoughts had upset Helen. She arrived home with no mood. She left her suitcases in the hallway and went into the kitchen, where Thomas was sitting at the table, singing tea and cake. Did the pie look homemade? The girl noted with a keen eye as she walked, and Thomas said, "Hello, hello." Thomas replied, looking intently at his wife, "How was your vacation?" "Fine." Faintly, Helen answered, not paying attention to her husband's tone. Having washed her hands, she was going to have tea too. She liked home-cooked food much better than restaurant meals, and airplane lunches were terrible. She couldn't lie. It's tasteless, like chewing on paper or rags. At home, at first glance, everything was fine. Looking around the kitchen, Helen noticed everything. A sparkling clean gas stove, obviously recently washed curtains on the window, a small bunch of flowers blazing on the windowsill. No sign of dirty dishes or cooking. Thomas left almost everything in order after cooking too, but now there was a woman's hand in everything. Helen was already sure that Susan would not let her down, a proven person. "You don't look like you're back from vacation. Why are you in no mood?" Thomas asked again. Helen was silent, cutting off a large piece of potato and meat pie. Without looking at her husband, she poured herself some tea from the heated kettle and sat down across from him. "Oh yes, I forgot to ask, how was Matthew?" "Didn't disappoint." Helen hesitated, bringing a piece of cake to her mouth, but then grinned, not wanting to show her confusion. Had Susan snitched? What a fool, in love with you like a cat, even that you are. Helen nodded at the stroller. "Doesn't stop her." "Don't you dare talk about her like that." Thomas was angry. Helen squinted her beautiful blue eyes. "Honey, did you two have an affair while I was away?" "Why? A knave fool and an invalid. What's not a couple?" At her own words, Helen laughed, forgetting the cake and tea. So funny, she thought, was the picture before her eyes. Susan looking at her husband and Thomas, pathetic in his wheelchair. What a bunch of weirdos, finding each other too. Thomas gritted his teeth. "Well, that's that, my dear. You can pack your things and go away. I knew about your affair a long time ago, and Susan had nothing to do with it. You've lost your conscience. In front of me, you've made dates and made love to your Matthew. I was hoping that at least you'd be sensible enough to come to your senses. To be so mean and come home without a shred of conscience? Are you sick, Thomas, or did you hit your head? Do you really think Susan's gonna take care of you now? Nobody wants you. You realize what you are, don't you? You're an invalid, a freak, an unfit freak. Do you even realize that?" Helen, heated by her husband's words, didn't remember that she had an unfinished piece of pie in her hand and crumbs stuck in the corners of her lips. With a wave of her hands, she knocked over the hot tea and shrieked, shaking off her dress. Further insults came as if from the horn of plenty. Thomas did not tolerate it and shouted, "Get ready." Helen grabbed the phone. "Hello, Susan. Don't you have anyone else to talk to? What are you doing with the inferior?" "I'm laughing my ass off right now. A handicapped man has found a mistress. Now you listen to me. I'm not going anywhere. Don't even try." "What? You're going to move out of your grandmother's house and into an apartment? Don't dream of it." Throwing the phone away, she turned to Thomas with flared nostrils. Don't even think about living in this apartment." She turned to Thomas. "In fact, I'll sue you for maintenance. You're obliged to maintain me." Thomas, as if seeing his wife for the first time, she looked like a witch from a horror movie, beautiful and scary at the same time. Blue flames blazed in her eyes. Her scarlet lips changed their shape, from a sinister smile to a contemptuous curve. Her hair spilled over her shoulders, and the woman was evil incarnate. Thomas even laughed. "How'd that make you feel? You even looked prettier when you started calling me names." "Calm down. Forget about your dreams. I'm disabled, and I got my apartment from my parents. So, Helen, you're gonna have to go to Matthew." The mention of her sneaky lover threw Helen off balance. She ripped her coat off the rack in a frenzy and ran out the door, cursing Thomas, Susan, and everything in the world. Susan hung up the phone and cried. Helen had just climbed, in big, muddy boots, into her soul, and in 2 minutes had trampled everything possible there, professionally trampled. God, why is everything so complicated? Why does she, Susan, get everything through the cracks, and not just straight and simple like the others? But if you think about it, Helen's right. Susan, her friend, just took advantage of Helen's absence. She's a regular bitch. And once again, Susan's days became gray and dull. Again, there was no reason to be happy, healed like before, only it was even harder. Now she didn't know how the man she loved smelled, what strong hands he had, how he knew how to lift her spirits and calm her down. It was all the more difficult to realize that now she would never be able to forget Thomas, and at the same time she would never be together with him. She would try to avoid even a chance meeting with him, but she had lost her friend too, and forever too. Susan got up in the morning, habitually drank her coffee with a sandwich, habitually went to work, talked, did everything that was supposed to be done there, even conscientiously and honestly. She could even smile. Outwardly, it was the same Susan. Only when she got home in the evening, she remembered those 15 days she had spent with Thomas. And no matter how hard she tried to push the memories away, she couldn't. As soon as the cheerful orange toenails came her way, she thought, "Is my bookcase still on his window?" She also smiled sadly. Thrown away long ago, of course. After all, it had been half a month since Helen had arrived. Walking into the pastry shop, I involuntarily searched with my eyes for a beautiful cake. I wish I could buy one so that I could have tea with Thomas in the evening. I shook my head and scolded myself. How could anyone go so crazy? How could you let yourself do such a thing? To develop in a couple of weeks an enduring habit toward the man, a habit of measuring everything in the world against Thomas's existence as if he belonged to her. No, it would drive her crazy. Something had to be done. Meanwhile, time passed, changing the pictures outside the window. The greenery on the trees was darker, the leaves had lost their freshness, and in some places they were tanning brown or even yellowing at the edges. The grass on the lawns also wilted a little. Only the sturdy marigolds, absolutely as before, shone bright orange like little suns, bringing joy to the sad landscape. Several months passed. Helen had not called once during that time, and Susan, of course, had not called either. Calling Thomas was out of the question. Susan felt guilty, and now a new feeling was slowly taking hold. She regretted what had happened, but not that she had betrayed her friend. No, she deeply regretted that she had not been able to convince Thomas that he was worthy of love and happiness. She should have gone back and rushed after him and told him he was no invalid. Doesn't she care if he's in a wheelchair or driving an expensive car? After all, he's still him. A priceless man with all his talents and inherent in him alone, marvelous eyes and noble heart. There was no telling how much longer this state of hers would last, hope mixed with the determination growing inside. It was becoming more her own, considered, fictionalized to her with each passing day. It became so much easier to live when Susan realized it seemed herself. She was now calm and confident. Even her gait changed in Susan, becoming more confident. Her back straightened, the girl seemed taller and slimmer. That evening she came home from work earlier than usual. She didn't want to go anywhere. Susan aspired for some reason to her cozy house, to the familiar comfort of wooden walls, where warmth and music always reigned. First of all, having turned on the melodies of the past years, she washed her hands and went to the kitchen to prepare a simple dinner. "What's up?" she asked from the refrigerator. "What are you guarding here?" The refrigerator was silent. Susan took out defrosted meat and potatoes and stood at the stove with a knife in her hand. "Who am I cooking all this for?" she said bitterly, forgetting how she had just been walking briskly down the street, convincing herself that life in mid-September was wonderful. How quickly do girls who live alone in a small old house change their moods? Her musings were interrupted by a knock on the door. Susan stood up. It must be one of the neighbors, for salt or matches. The houses in the private sector were densely packed, and everyone knew each other, and since it was a short walk to the store, they often went to each other's houses for small things. As a matter of course, they took for granted small requests to neighbors and mutual favors and services. Susan walked quietly, but had time to wonder as she walked. The door was normally open, and they came in easily, without ringing or knocking. She opened the door and almost fell in. On the porch was Thomas. He had a huge bouquet of flowers in his lap. And yes, they were fragrant, fire-burning marigolds, Susan's ubiquitous and adored small flowers. Coals burning, even releasing already in the semi-darkness. Several months passed. Helen had not called once during that time, and Susan, of course, had not called either. Calling Thomas was out of the question. Susan felt guilty, and now a new feeling was slowly taking hold. She regretted what had happened, but not that she had betrayed her friend. No, she deeply regretted that she had not been able to convince Thomas that he was worthy of love and happiness. She should have gone back and rushed after him and told him he was no invalid. Doesn't she care if he's in a wheelchair or driving an expensive car? After all, he's still him. A priceless man with all his talents and inherent in him alone, marvelous eyes and noble heart. There was no telling how much longer this state of hers would last, hope mixed with the determination growing inside. It was becoming more her own, considered, fictionalized to her with each passing day. It became so much easier to live when Susan realized it seemed herself. She was now calm and confident. Even her gait changed in Susan, becoming more confident. Her back straightened. The girl seemed taller and slimmer. That evening she came home from work earlier than usual. She didn't want to go anywhere. Susan aspired for some reason to her cozy house, to the familiar comfort of wooden walls, where warmth and music always reigned. First of all, having turned on the melodies of the past years, she washed her hands and went to the kitchen to prepare a simple dinner. "What's up?" she asked from the refrigerator. "What are you guarding here?" The refrigerator was silent. Susan took out defrosted meat and potatoes and stood at the stove with a knife in her hand. "Who am I cooking all this for?" she said bitterly, forgetting how she had just been walking briskly down the street, convincing herself that life in mid-September was wonderful. How quickly do girls who live alone in a small old house change their moods? Her musings were interrupted by a knock on the door. Susan stood up. It must be one of the neighbors, for salt or matches. The houses in the private sector were densely packed and everyone knew each other, and since it was a short walk to the store, they often went to each other's houses for small things. As a matter of course, they took for granted small requests to neighbors and mutual favors and services. Susan walked quietly, but had time to wonder as she walked. The door was normally open, and they came in easily, without ringing or knocking. She opened the door and almost fell in. On the porch was Thomas. He had a huge bouquet of flowers in his lap. And yes, they were fragrant, fire-burning marigolds, Susan's ubiquitous and adored small flowers. Coals burning, even releasing already in the semi-darkness, Susan awed and pressed her hands to her cheeks. Susan, in short, I can't be without you. If the prospect of being the wife of an invalid doesn't frighten you, Jesus, Thomas, what are you talking about? What kind of invalid are you? Susan deftly rolled Thomas' wheelchair across the threshold and stepped forward to open the door. Thomas rolled smoothly inside, stopping in the kitchen. He smiled and rubbed his hands together. It seems there's no need for man hands around here. What good timing, if you only knew. Susan whispered, lowering herself into the chair next to Thomas and reaching for him. However, the endless hugs and kisses did not prevent the lovers from preparing a delicious dinner. After all, Thomas had become almost a pro at cooking, practicing in the kitchen almost from the beginning of his stroller life. They talked loudly across the hallways of the room, heard no response, talked again, and it didn't matter what about. Susan, eyes shining, was running back and forth through the house because she had decided to set dinner in the hall. She pulled out the festive tablecloth, rattled the cups from her grandmother's set, ran to the kitchen to wash the flutes. Then she laughed for a long time without saying why. After she laughed, she confessed to Thomas, I don't have any wine to pour into the glasses. The store's closed. What's the trouble? Thomas reassured her. We'll pour tea in them. After confessing their love to each other 100 times, the young people finally sat down at the table. They clinked the tea poured into crystal flutes, and Thomas coughed, playing the old Toastmaster. Let us drink this divine nectar to the fact that the walls of this splendid house will never hear the crying or see the tears of its beautiful mistress. Susan, looking confusedly into Thomas's eyes, interrupted him at the last words. A beautiful toast. Thank you, Thomas. But you know, I suggest we drink to something else. I have a surprise for you, so let's drink to it. She held out a leaf across the table to Thomas. The man took it carefully in both hands and scrutinized it carefully. It was not a clear picture from the ultrasound machine, but a photograph of a new life being born. An early call on a Sunday morning can drive anyone crazy, and instantly. As much as Susan was always ready to help, she jumped up from her bachelor couch in a frenzy. She threw on a brightly colored silk robe that was about to slip off her shoulders and rushed to the door to pour all her indignation on the caller. Whoever the early visitor was, now he would get the full measure of it. But the girl had to not only hide her anger, but also to worry about the newcomer. In the hallway stood her best friend and part-time neighbor Helen. When Susan saw her face in the door peephole, she began to twist the lock with shaking hands, but as always in such cases, it did not open for some reason. Finally, Susan swung the door open and almost screamed in Helen's face. What's wrong? Thomas isn't well. Helen looked at her friend in surprise. He's fine. What are you doing? Susan exhaled and invited her in. Come in, since you haven't slept since 7 o'clock in the morning. Her friend's behavior was not quite usual. Usually she fell on the sofa near the table and waited for Susan to serve tea or make coffee. But Helen never stopped chatting, looking in the refrigerator for goodies and asking Susan questions. In short, she behaved as if she were at home. And today even her steps were slow, giving away the girl's embarrassment. "How are you?" she asked, not boldly, finally, after some fumbling on the sofa. "What do you mean, how?" Susan's eyes widened. "I was asleep, and you got up at the crack of dawn." Considering the fact that only a few hours had passed together, it was a very strange question, without substance, as their former higher math teacher would say. Looking at her friend carefully, Susan realized that the matter was not clear and asked, "Why did you come here?" "Susan." Helen looked at her with the most honest blue eyes she had ever seen. "Susan, let me go to the sea." Susan looked into that purity and blue and was silent. "Why do you look at me like that?" "I've been taking ducks out for 3 years. Thomas this, Thomas that. I'm sick of it. I want to take a vacation, and Matthew has already bought the tickets, booked the hotel. I'm expecting such romance, mountains, sea, buffet, and you're ruining my mood with your sour face." "Helen, how can you not be ashamed? He's your husband." Susan was kind, but honest and fair. Her friend's cheating while her husband was alive was not just unpleasant, but disgusting. These conversations between friends had been going on for a long time, and Helen had reacted to them just as she did now. So what? I'm a human being too, and I need positive emotions, otherwise I'll languish. I'm already completely feral. I've turned into an old woman. People go everywhere, go to the sea, have a vacation, but me. Helen almost cried. She felt sorry for herself. "Well, Susan, you won't refuse me, will you?" "I still don't understand how it's possible." "Thomas is not stupid. He understands everything. He'll know you've gone off with your lover." "I don't care. Maybe then he'll realize what I'm sacrificing." "Helen, you're playing with fire. Have you forgotten who makes your money? Even now that Thomas is in a wheelchair, you're on his payroll. You haven't forgotten that his bright head gives you everything. And you don't work, and you still don't work. Why do you reproach me with a piece of bread?" "Of course I don't work. I'm probably married, taking care of him. He must be an invalid. He needs a nurse." Helen's mood changed 100 times in half an hour. "Oh, Helen." She always knew how to defend herself, and now she squinted her eyes and smiled predatorily. "Are you in love with my invalid husband? You're worried about him, confess." Susan, suddenly blushing, shook her head negatively. "You're such a pest." Helen had no intention of backing down. "Well, if you don't want to, then don't. I'll find out. Obviously there are some services. Can't I find a nurse in a big city for 10 days? And she walked proudly out the door with her snub nose.